Boys, be careful now. Remember not to stray too far into the deep water.
Oh my God, what is this? So much blood. I've got to call the police. I think there's been a murder.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Prash's Murder Map. Today we'll be discussing the Lake Bodom murders. Now this has been a particularly difficult case and it's one of my favourite unsolved murders. Probably the most famous unsolved murder in Finnish history. And I would say it's definitely within my top 10 unsolved crimes of all time. So it's really great that I've got the opportunity to present it here today. I spent a lot of time working on it and I've had a lot of help along the way. My wife's been very helpful. I also got in touch with a Finnish friend of mine who was very helpful in giving some translations and helping me pronounce certain words. So hopefully I've got it down to a T and it will come across well today because it's been quite difficult. And obviously me not speaking the language, it can be quite alien. So apologies in advance if I pronounce anything incorrectly. However, I've got it on good authority that Lake Bodom is actually pronounced Budem. So we'll be going with that today as the correct pronunciation. My Finnish friend was also very helpful in translating some written material as well as audio interviews, so I will be referring to those throughout the episode. As always, this episode contains adult themes. Listener discretion is advised. So without further ado, let's put on our walking boots, strap on our backpacks, gather up our provisions and hike to Lake Bodom on the suburbs of Espoo, a city in southern Finland, not too far from the capital Helsinki. The area is sparsely populated, with 2 islands in the lake and a popular beach. Visitors enjoy hiking in the summer and skiing in the winter. In that part of Finland, summers are mild and warm and the days are long. So the 4 teenagers excitedly getting ready for a camping trip on a sunny Saturday in 1960 had no reason to worry about spending a night out in nature. 15-year-olds Mila Ameli Bjorklund and Anja Tulikimäki rode with their 18-year-old boyfriends, Seppo Antero Boisman and Niels Willem Gustafsson on their motorbikes to the Lake Bodom campsite. Anja and Seppo had known each other for a long time, Mila and Niels for only 3 weeks, but the boys had been friends since the early 50s and were both apprentice metalworkers in a foundry. It would be Mila's 16th birthday on Monday. The boys told their parents they were going fishing together, but like typical teenagers, they didn't mention that the girls would be joining them. When they arrived at the campsite on the evening of Saturday 4th of June, they leaned the motorbikes against one of the many birch trees surrounding the site, put up the tent, and enjoyed the freedom of the outdoors. Even the occasional rustling of leaves and the sudden hoot of an owl didn't bother them. If they looked up at the star-speckled sky, they would have seen the moon rising bright and round. It was only a few days away from being a full moon, so the campsite would have been well illuminated, and anyway, the sun doesn't fully set until very late on a Finnish summer night. They chatted until about 10 p.m, and the 2 boys drank alcohol. They went to bed about 11. Mila kept a diary and wrote that Seppo went fishing at about 2 in the morning. At this time, the sun would already be coming up. Niels went with him for a swim and had returned to the tent a little earlier than Seppo, who returned empty-handed without catching any fish. It had all been fun and games so far, but none of them could have guessed how violently their trip would end. At around 11 a.m. the next morning, carpenter Esko Johansson was taking his children for a swim when he stumbled on a horrifying scene.
Boys, be careful now. Remember not to stray too far into the deep water.
Oh my God, what is this? So much blood. I've got to call the police. I think there's been a murder.
The teenager's tent lay collapsed and shredded on the ground, as though it had been slashed with a knife. There were two shapes underneath. On top of the tent lay Mila, Niels Gustafsson's girlfriend, naked from the waist down and covered in blood and stab wounds. Gustafsson himself lay on top of her, unmoving. Heart pounding, Johansson ran as fast as he could to phone the police. He had never seen anything like it in his life. When the police arrived, they found that 3 of the teens were dead, but miraculously, Niels Gustafsson was still alive. At first glance, it looked like the assailant had cut the tent ropes before slashing and stabbing at the victims from the outside. It seemed that Gustafsson had got lucky. He was rushed to hospital with concussion, head wounds and a broken jaw. He couldn't remember anything about what had happened. As well as a knife, a blunt object had been used in the vicious frenzy. The autopsies on the 8th of June found that Seppo Boisman had cuts to the face, fractured jaw, cranial hemorrhage, and had been stabbed in the chest, stomach, lung and throat. The cause of death was attributed to internal bleeding. Niels's girlfriend, Mila Bjorklund, had bruising to the head and face, fractured jaw, missing teeth and numerous stab wounds, one of which had penetrated the cervical spine. For her, the cause of death was brain damage due to blunt force trauma to the head. Boisman's girlfriend, Anja Mäki, had a cranial fracture and bruising to the brain, and her cause of death was also brain damage due to blunt force trauma. None of the victims had been sexually assaulted. Niels Gustafsson had facial fractures, including a broken jaw and a wound to the side of his head above the left ear. He also had various superficial stab wounds and abrasions on the fingers of his left hand. No weapons were found on the scene, despite a full search with metal detectors and lake divers, aided by many volunteers. Some items were missing from the scene. The keys to both motorbikes were gone, but the bikes themselves were still there. More strangely, Gustafsson and Boisman's shoes were found about half a mile away from the tent, splattered with blood. Also missing were a bag, a pair of chrome pliers, a penknife, Boisman's black leather jacket, and the boys' wallets and watches. Inside the wallets were their driving licenses and motorcycle registry documents, as well as some money. A pillowcase wrapped with a rubber band was found at the scene containing blood and bodily fluids, which didn't match any of the victims. It was later suggested that the pillowcase could have been there already and may not have been significant. Also scattered around the scene were items belonging to the group, including a table knife, makeup items, food, cigarettes, gloves, and some partially full bottles of soft drinks and alcohol. The police were criticised for their incompetent investigation. They didn't cordon off the area, so curious campers and interested onlookers were quick to come and visit the scene, contaminating any physical evidence. The police questioned about 4,000 people, including 100 known criminals from the local area, but didn't turn up many solid leads. Nobody had witnessed the crime, but at about 6 AM, 2 11-year-old birdwatchers named Heikki Salonen and Martti Hypalainen heard a noise. Looking closer, they saw the tent and motorcycles, and a man laying on top of the tent who they thought was sunbathing, and a blonde-haired man walking eastwards towards the shore. However, it should be mentioned that the word when translated into English means blonde, but in Finnish could also mean light brown. They couldn't see much further because the motorcycles were blocking their view. The young boys then moved westward and came across a 14-year-old named Olavi Kivalahti, who was waiting for his friends to join him for a morning of fishing. When questioned later, Olavi claimed to have arrived at about 4 a.m, but didn't hear anything. Around 6 a.m, he did see a man walking towards the nearby Vesto waterworks site, hurrying away from what we now know is the direction of the murder cape. He was 20 to 30 years of age, 5'5" to 5'9" inches tall, had brown hair, dark pants, and was wearing a light-coloured coat. Olavi wasn't sure if he was carrying anything, but he was short-sighted. He waited in the area for several hours, but his friends had stood him up, so he eventually decided to leave around 8 a.m. Survivor Niels Gustafsson spent 3 or 4 weeks in hospital and never regained his full memory of that night, but he agreed to undergo hypnosis. The hypnotist, Dr. Assa Stenbeck, delved into Gustafsson's memories on 3 separate occasions between the 2nd and the 5th of July to find that the killer was not someone he knew. He was about 20 to 30 years of age, between 5'7" and 5'10", with long blonde hair combed backwards. He had big eyes, a round face with acne on the forehead and cheeks, thick lips, a prominent jawline, a short neck, and was wearing a green and black checkered sweater. Gustafsson remembered hearing the girl screaming and thought that the man was carrying a knife and a metal bar or pipe-like object. 14-year-old Olavi was also hypnotised several times and confirmed the descriptions given by Gustafsson, but he was known to be short-sighted, so how could hypnosis suddenly make him see with greater clarity what the man had looked like? It has been argued that hypnotism has no place in a criminal investigation, as questions can be leading and generate false memories. At the time, Finnish police had very little experience in using hypnosis to assist in murder cases. So who were the suspects? Apart from various characters who were eliminated as possibilities, including an ex-convict on the run from reform school who hung himself on the anniversary of the murders, there were some who stood out. Gillström, the kiosk man. Carl Valdemar Gillström ran a kiosk on the road near the Vesto waterworks, selling soda, ice cream and gum. He was known for overzealously guarding the road leading to the waterworks and seemed to take offence to anyone driving up and down in that area. He had reportedly been aggressive towards campers and had cut down their tents in the past and even thrown rocks at them. Allegedly, he confessed to the murders while he was drunk in a sauna with a neighbour. Drinking alcohol in a sauna would likely lead to dehydration and confusion, so how seriously can we take this? He was seen filling up one of the wells on his land shortly after the murder, and the police brought in dogs to search, as they thought he could be hiding the murder weapons, but nothing incriminating was found. He also had an alibi. His wife claimed he was at home with her all night. In 1969, Gillström was said to have drowned himself in Lake Bodom, which some saw as a sign of guilt, although some said it was just an accident. Years later, on her deathbed, his wife recanted the alibi, saying that her husband had threatened to kill her if she didn't provide it, and she was worried what he might do to their sons. We don't know much else about Gillström. Although he was known to have a bad temper, and locals favoured him as the most likely suspect, police at the time didn't take his confession seriously, and the case against him is mainly circumstantial. Had he been the murderer, witnesses would also have been able to recognise him as he was so well known. Now, I had a look into the suicide rates in Finland, as several suspects killed themselves. And this is kind of interesting because the rates in Finland were high, particularly in the 1950s to the 1990s, and it was actually above the national average for an EU country. Hans Arsman, the spy. Another suspect seemed more likely to the police at the time and remained a person of interest for many years. Hans Arsman was originally from Germany and had claimed to be a guard at Auschwitz before being sent to the Eastern Front and becoming a KGB spy. He was also a morphine and amphetamine addict. On the day after the Lake Bodom murders, he went to the Helsinki Surgical Hospital, with dirt under his fingernails and suspicious red stains all over his clothing, which turned out to be paint. In an interview, Dr. Parlow, a student doctor at the time, said,
"A strange-looking blonde-haired man, identifying himself as Hans Arsman, came to our hospital some time after the murders. He arrived alone. I was a student at the time, working under a supervisor called Carlo Lindholm, a brilliant doctor in his own right. There was also another colleague, a Dr. Silvola. When Arsman came to us, he asked the nurses for paint thinner so that he could wash off some red paint from his hands. Naturally, we provided him with this. He tried to scare the nurses by talk of murders back in his home country of Germany. He even had a magazine with him, headlining such cases. He then started feigning unconsciousness, so he was brought to us in the outpatients department and subsequently examined by Dr. Silvola. He poked him with a needle to check his reactions. Suddenly, he opened his eyes when he felt the sharp jab of the needle, but soon went back to pretending to be unconscious. Of course, by that time, we didn't believe his act. We got the distinct impression he was here to seek shelter and was not genuinely seeking medical care. We called the police after suspecting Arsman may have done something bad, or to interrogate him. The clothes were given back to Arsman, and he left. I've always believed he had something to do with the murder of those children at the lake. After all, his clothes were dirty, shoes covered in dirt, as if he had run a mile in a forest, his appearance that of a crazed man. I strongly believe he had something to do with the deaths of those teenagers."
Dr. Parlow would go on to write 3 books on Arsman, convinced of his guilt. The police never followed up on the doctor's suspicions and never examined his clothes. Also, Arsman had an alibi for the night of the murders. He had been staying with his girlfriend, her sister and brother-in-law, who were sure he wouldn't have left the house without them noticing. If he had committed the murders, why turn up at the hospital a whole day and a half later anyway? That would mean he had been walking around all that time with red-stained clothes and dirt under his fingernails. Arsman's appearance didn't help his case. The few witnesses who had seen someone at the lake had reported a man with long blonde hair who met Arsman's description. He then made himself look even more suspicious by cutting his hair shortly afterwards. Just to clarify, when they said long hair, they didn't mean it in the way we would today, like Bjorn Borglong. It probably just meant longer than close cropped or maybe a bit untidy. Gustafsson's description of the killer under hypnosis also matched Arsman, although he had probably been exposed to media coverage before the session and could have been unconsciously influenced by it. He did live less than 5 kilometers away from the campsite, and on his deathbed he hinted at his involvement in the 1953 murder of schoolgirl Kilikisari, but there's no evidence for this. Some people believe that Arsman can be seen in a photo taken at the funeral of the 3 victims. However, this person has never been officially identified, and I believe that while it resembles Arsman later, aged 50 or so, it did not look anything like him at the time of the murders. I will be posting a few pictures of Arsman, along with the crime scene photos in the show notes and on my website, so check those out. Some conspiracy theorists say that the police didn't want to go after Arsman because of his ties to the KGB. However, it has never been proved that he ever was an agent. I believe he was just a fantasist and teller of tall tales, enjoying drawing attention to himself. He enjoyed infamy and seeing his name in the newspaper, and the stories of his past at Auschwitz and as a spy cannot be corroborated and only come from his own histrionics. What sort of former KGB agent would freely admit to being a spy anyway? It all seems too convenient. We see similar things in many cases over the years, where people eagerly confess to crimes they didn't commit, and other colourful characters who seem very suspicious but had nothing to do with it. Arsman might be a compelling suspect, but like with Gilstrom the kiosk man, the evidence is really just circumstantial. Now I'm going to throw a curveball into this story. There was a murder in eastern Finland just 10 months before the Lake Bodom murders, which bore striking similarities. 2 young women in their early 20s, Einen, a nursing assistant, and Rita, a post office worker, were killed at Lahti while on a cycling holiday. They had been killed with a mixture of stabbing and bludgeoning and were stripped naked before being buried in a shallow grave. Their tent was torn and money had been stolen. One of their wristwatches had been ripped off but was found nearby, having stopped at 3:27 a.m. It seems an interesting coincidence that less than a year later, the Lake Bodom victims' watches would also be taken. Could these be the work of a serial killer? These cases have never been solved. The Lake Bodom case went cold for over 40 years, until in March 2004, an arrest was made. Niels Gustafsson, the surviving victim of the attack. By this time he was over 60, working as a school bus driver and married with 2 grown-up children. He had always been cooperative with the police and had to live daily with the trauma of losing his friends that night. He strongly denied any guilt. In a press conference before the trial, Gustafsson stated that his last memory of 5th of June was of saying goodnight to each other. After that, the next thing he knew was waking up at the Red Cross Centre. When asked how he could be sure he was innocent if he didn't remember anything, he simply replied, "I'm innocent and that's that." He said that since his arrest he had been under a lot of strain, and he became impatient when a reporter didn't hear one of his answers, showing that he might have a bad temper. So why did the police suspect him after so many years? As forensics had improved over the last few decades, they could now analyse the blood on the shoes. What they found was interesting. The blood of all 3 of the other victims was on Gustafsson's shoes, found abandoned half a mile away, but his own blood was mysteriously absent. The other 3 pairs had blood splatter inside them, so were not being worn at the time of the murder, while Gustafsson's shoes had no blood splatter inside, only outside, so they must have been on someone's feet at the time. The prosecution's explanation for this was not consistent throughout. One of their pre-trial statements said the following:
"This violent crime took place outside the tent. We believe that Gustafsson killed Boisman, first by stabbing him in the neck, then used a combination of a rock and a knife to kill the others. When he realized it would appear more believable that a third party had committed the murders, he went about staging it. He first started by cutting the tent ropes to make it look like it had collapsed, trapping the victims inside. Gustafsson then stabbed holes in the tent at the approximate points of the entry wounds belonging to Boisman's injuries. However, he made a mistake, as not all of these match up with the wounds on the victims. If Gustafsson cut the tent ropes first, then the stab wounds would be more arbitrary, as he wouldn't have known where to aim his knife. But instead, they're far too precise. Gustafsson is the perpetrator, and an imaginative one at that."
It sounds like they were suggesting that he killed the victims outside the tent before staging the crime, but at no point do they mention the fact he would have had to move all 3 bodies into the tent. It also suggests that everyone but Niels was standing around outside the tent without their shoes on. By the time the trial came along, their statement had evolved into a slightly different scenario.
Bjorklund, Boisman, Maki, and Gustafsson had arrived at Lake Bodom Beach on Saturday, the 4th of June, 1960, around 6 to 7 p.m. After setting up the tent, the group spent some time together, and at some point, they visited another group camping around a kilometer away. By now, Niels Gustafsson was already drunk and started arguing with Boisman. A witness stated the argument was about girls. After the group returned to their tent, the fighting continued. The rest of the group shut Gustafsson out of the tent and closed the opening. In a fit of rage, Gustafsson ripped holes in the tent's exterior and cut the ropes which were keeping it up, causing it to collapse. He assaulted Boisman, who defended himself by kicking him, breaking his jaw. Gustafsson viciously stabbed Boisman in the throat and attacked him with a rock. Maki tried to escape, but he hit her in the head with the same weapon. After that, he used it again to hit Bjorklund, fracturing her jaw and breaking her teeth, and then he stabbed her multiple times. Gustafsson disposed of the weapons and the other missing items by sinking them in the lake or burying them nearby. He hid his and Boisman's shoes about 600 meters away. He ripped holes in the tent with the intention of misleading and removed Bjorklund's clothes and hid the missing items to give the impression that the crime was motivated by sex and theft. He then laid down on top of Bjorklund and played dead. A comprehensive investigation of the blood stain shows that there was no blood of an outsider on the tent or on Gustafsson's shoes, and the stains do not match Gustafsson's description of their sleeping positions inside the tent. His blood inside the tent most likely came from his injuries from his fight with Boisman. The stains on Gustafsson's shoes show that they were on his feet when the crime was committed, as there was only blood on the outside and not in the void. Gustafsson had no defense wounds. The medical report showed that he was fully functional even with his injuries, and they hadn't caused him any real loss of conscious or decreased mobility. He didn't have any brain damage or memory degradation. If Gustafsson wasn't the killer, then he should have been able to call for help. He is short-tempered and violent by nature. He's also notably larger than anyone else in the group, standing at 6 feet in height, whereas his victims were 5'6" or under. This makes him more than capable of having committed the murders. Even after the event, he was systematically exaggerating his injuries, drawing the attention away from him. In conclusion, it seems that Nils Gustafsson is the only viable suspect and has been falsely seen as a victim.
The fact that it was Mila Bjorklund, Gustafsson's girlfriend, who bore the brunt of the attacker's rage, also points towards him as the killer. She was the only one who was stabbed 15 times, with the attack continuing after she was dead, making her the focal point of the crime. This seems very personal, and we know that many crimes are committed by someone known to the victim. The prosecution argued that the blunt object used was a rock, not a pipe-like object that Gustafsson mentioned during the hypnosis. They may have twisted this to support their belief of his guilt, and in the transcript they never explained why they believed it to be a rock. Remember, the murder weapons were never found, so there's no evidence for this either way. But a pipe-like object would suggest an external killer, as Gustafsson wouldn't have brought something like that on a camping trip. But a rock could have been grabbed at random, pointing more towards an unplanned attack by Gustafsson. However, a rock would have been difficult to grip, while wielding it hard enough to kill. Maybe the prosecution hoped to plant the idea in the jury's mind that he had disposed of the rock in the river afterwards, never to be found. The defence argued that the attacker could have been an outsider. The DNA profile from the tent was only taken from a few blood samples, not all of them. An outsider killer may have left DNA on the tent, but in a spot that wasn't tested, or maybe he didn't leave any DNA at all. 3 doctors testified, confirming that amnesia in this situation was possible. How could Gustafsson have dragged out his hospital stay for so long if his injuries were as minor as the prosecution said they were? They also found the blood spatter evidence was in line with Gustafsson being inside the tent at the time of the attack. With injuries warranting a 3 or 4 week hospital stay, how could he have been strong enough to walk half a mile to hide his shoes and back again? This would also have been a dangerous move, as he risked being spotted. He was, after all, a very tall man for that time, and somebody would surely have remarked on seeing him. As for the story about them going to someone else's tent that night, this came from the testimony of a witness who only came forward in 2004.
We were camping at the camping area, but the Budem group were at the tip of the peninsula that doesn't belong to the camping area. You can still camp in the peninsula. The Budem group were of a similar age to us, and that evening we arrived at the general camping area. We drank a small amount of alcohol. Sometime during that evening, the Budem group visited us from the peninsula after seeing us there. The 2 boys got into an argument over girls. They made so much noise. We asked them to leave. After they left to go back to their tent, we could still hear them arguing and shouting. I then heard a motorbike start up and I thought, oh my god, is that foolish drunk boy really going to ride his motorbike? It's clear in our minds that they visited our camp that evening. It is also clear to me who murdered them because it was done spontaneously and not planned ahead.
There has been some confusion over whether this witness was a man or a woman. This has come about partly because they didn't want their identity known, and partly because the Finnish language is gender neutral, using the same word for he or she. However, I did manage to find the original Finnish audio of this statement, and it was definitely a man. The witness's reliability is highly questionable. Why wait 44 years to tell this tale? How would he even remember the events of a night so long ago, when I can barely tell you what I had for dinner last Tuesday? This witness was also caught out in court because he could not remember the names of his own friends he'd been supposedly camping with that night. It was also proven that the route between the two campsites was impassable in 1960. In any case, if the murdered teenagers had visited another camp that night and started an argument, Mila would surely have written about it in her own diary. The witness also took part in a documentary, so it is possible he was offered a financial incentive to tell a story that fitted the prosecution's case. There was also an unsubstantiated statement by policeman Marko Tuominen, who said that when Gustafsson was arrested, he threw himself onto the bed saying, "What's done is done, I'll get 15 years for it." This is hearsay, and was not recorded in Tuominen's notes, and was only brought up at the trial. The judge rightly dismissed it. On October the 7th, 2005, all charges against Gustafsson were unanimously rejected. The prosecution chose not to pursue the case further, suggesting they knew their evidence was weak. Gustafsson received compensation for his ordeal. So what really did happen on that seemingly peaceful summer night in 1960? Before we get into that, let's hear from Niels Gustafsson himself in an extract of an interview he had prior to 2004. This is a small piece from a 50-minute interview that I've had translated from Finnish to English and is spoken by a voice actor. What you're about to hear has never been made public in English before.
Tell us about your relationship with Seppo Boisman and the girls. Seppo and I were childhood friends from the early 50s. I visited him at home sometimes. He had gotten to know the girls before me. I probably had known them for 3 weeks. After the trip we were all planning to go to Mila's house for coffee and birthday cake, but of course that never happened. What did you do that day? We went to Stromberg and rented a tent. It was an old-fashioned design from the 1940s, which did not have a zippered front, but used tie string for the doorway. We had no sleeping bags, just blankets. Then Seppo and I went to the cafe and drank soda pop. Seppo stopped at the kiosk to buy gum and ice cream that afternoon. The kiosk owner's wife said I stopped there too, but that's not true. We then went to the lake and went swimming. We tried fishing but had no worms, only bread, but the fish were not hungry. Then we picked up the girls and arrived back at the lake around 6-7 p.m. and set up the tent together. What was the next thing you remembered? Waking up in hospital on Wednesday or Thursday. There was an old man in the hospital bed next to me. He looked over at me and started speaking. "Do you want a cigarette?" he offered. I had no idea what had just happened. They never told me a thing until about 3 weeks later. I couldn't believe it, but it was true. I had to come to terms with it after visiting the graveyard. I was in the hospital for about a month, but 3 weeks at the ear clinic. I was bleeding from my ear because there were pieces from my jawbone pushing against it. Did you see or talk with anyone at the lake? While we were in our camp sitting outside the tent, we just talked and joked. We were far too shy to talk about sex or anything like that. It's different nowadays. In those days, that type of thing didn't cross our minds at all. What do you think about all of this in retrospect?
It has happened. No way to undo it. I wish I could be face to face with the person who did this.
Since the incident, were you in touch with their parents?
Yes, a lot, but sadly they are all passed away now, maybe 10 years ago. I've been back to Lake Bodom many times, sometimes to help with the investigation. It frightens me. I visit my friends' graves twice a year, usually Christmas and then either the 4th, 5th or 6th of June.
The fact that Gustafsson and Boisman had spent the morning together on 4th of June and had known each other for years is something rarely mentioned by the prosecution or people who think Niels is guilty. He has also stayed in touch with his friend's parents, so clearly they didn't have any suspicion over Niels' character. I agree with the court's findings. Gustafsson was innocent. Let's look at the evidence. In addition to 3 doctors testifying during the trial about Gustafsson's condition, Dr. Parlow also spoke out before the trial, saying the following.
When I looked into Gustafsson, I discovered that cerebrospinal fluid was exuding from Gustafsson's nose, which is a strong indicator of a serious cranial fracture. A man whose cerebrospinal fluid is coming out of his nose is not going to be able to move around quickly. The mystery witness, whose name is not made public, but only came forward 45 years later, bases Gustafsson's motive on jealousy. The bottom line is that I don't believe this is going to work out too well for the prosecution.
He was right. As we've heard, the prosecution lost the case and chose not to appeal it. As for the practicalities, where would Gustafsson have hidden all the missing items? The jacket, the watches, the wallets, the bags, pliers and the penknife. The whole area was thoroughly combed and frogmen even searched the lake. Some of these items, such as the wallets, could have been in the pockets of Boisman's leather jacket for safekeeping or even in the bag that was taken, rather than these items deliberately being stolen. If Niels had been the killer, he would also have had to walk the half a mile back to the tent barefoot after hiding his shoes. If we were to believe the prosecution story, Gustafsson would have had to be cold-blooded enough to lie on top of his friends' bodies for at least 5 hours. He also knew he was injured but probably didn't know how badly. It would have been a massive risk for him to deliberately stay laying there without seeking medical help. In response to the observation that it was Gustafsson's girlfriend who received the worst injuries and seemed to be the focus of the attack, it could simply be that she was the one to put up most of a fight. The boys were drunk and may have taken longer to realise what was happening. The attacker would naturally want to subdue the one thrashing around under the tent the most. The stab wounds were inflicted after she was already dead, but the killer may have just wanted to make sure. It would have been difficult for one person to carry out these murders. They would have had to cut the tent ropes and subdue all 4 teenagers very quickly. Just try to imagine the scene. You're sneaking up to the tent housing 4 people. In your dominant hand you hold a rock or a metal bar. In your other hand you grip a knife. Or do you just hold the knife and leave the rock on the ground? You cut the tent ropes, but then have to grab the rock to bludgeon them before they can get to their feet? Or are you still holding the knife in your other hand? Or did you have to drop the knife, wasting precious seconds in the process? Given the speed and ferocity of the attack, it's more likely to have been 2 people, each with a separate weapon. If just one person was holding both, how would they use the weapon in their non-dominant hand with enough force to kill? Here's how it could have happened. This is my theory, which has been given credence by the friendly folk over on Murho, the Finnish murder forum. It's likely that the teenagers were targeted because of the quiet location of where they'd chosen to camp, as they were on the peninsula and not in the main camping area, which was more heavily populated. With 2 killers, there could have been 2 separate motives. It could have been a combination of theft and a simple desire for violence. It is often said that killing with a knife can deliver sexual gratification, particularly if the killer is impotent, so this could also have been a part of the motivation for one of them. The two killers removed their shoes and crept up to the tent to ensure a silent approach. One of the killers, perhaps the more cautious one, put on Gustafsson's shoes to prevent blood splatter on his socks. Why would he think to do this? Well, if he had killed before, possibly even the Lahti double murder, he would have learnt that murder is messy. At Lahti, the police said the killer would have been covered head to toe in blood splatter. When he saw the teenager's shoes outside the tent, he remembered the last time and took the opportunity to avoid getting blood on his own. The second killer could have been more desperate to get on with the murders. It's not unusual with cases of two killers for one to be more organised and the other to be disorganised, for example the Hillside Stranglers or the Railway Killers of England. According to the original police statement written by the detectives who investigated, some pipe parts had been brought by a blacksmith to the Vesto waterworks site that night, so maybe the killers picked one up. After all, didn't Gustafsson say during the hypnosis that he thought the weapon could have been a pipe or a metal bar? One of the killers then cut the rope, making the tent collapse. They then stabbed and hit the victims in a bloody free-for-all. They hurriedly stole what they could find and partially undressed Bjorklund before leaving, perhaps as some form of humiliation or sexual gratification. They were worried about footprints and tread patterns, so at this point the other killer put on Boisman's shoes as they ran from the scene in the direction of the road leading to the kiosk. They may have thought that police would have been able to track them down by their shoe prints. Once far enough away, they removed the bloody shoes, partially hiding them in a ditch, and put their own back on. One of them also took Boisman's leather jacket, possibly to hide the bloodstains on his own shirt. It's possible that they had heard people approaching, maybe the birdwatchers at around 6 AM, which spurred them on to hurry as quickly as possible. It was obvious that people had started to wake up and arrive for their early morning walks, and they couldn't risk being spotted. Or maybe the killers were long gone by that time, as the birdwatchers did only see one person, unless the two split up and went in different directions. Eyewitness descriptions are also notoriously unreliable, and as the birdwatchers didn't know until later that anything was wrong, there was no reason for them to take note of anyone they saw. As for the pillowcase found at the scene, it contained small bloodstains but were not type A or O, and therefore was confirmed not to belong to the victims. There was also a trace of semen. The teenagers hadn't even brought pillows and were using their jackets to lay on. Perhaps the pillowcase was laying there already, or had been brought by the killers as a way of carrying their weapons to the scene. The rubber band could have been used to secure one end to prevent them accidentally falling out. The bloodstains could have belonged to one of them if they were injured during the attack, as it's very common when attacking someone with a knife to cut yourself in the process. So who were these two killers? Some Finnish crime aficionados suspect a man called Teuvo Korhanen, who was 23 at the time. Throughout his life he was married numerous times and had an extensive criminal record, including a charge of attempted manslaughter, and was known to have antisocial personality disorder. Korhanen was a suspect in the Lahti murders and did not have an alibi. The most important factor in that suspicion was a wall that had been built in the woods, with holes through which a voyeur would watch girls swimming. Behind the wall, a pornographic magazine had been left with a page ripped out. This missing page was found in Korhanen's house. It is believed that he teamed up with his friend, Lytic, and that they committed both the Lahti and Budem murders together. Both these murders are similar in that the attacks were against people who were in a tent and two different weapons were used. In Lahti, there were signs of a sexual motive, which included a partial undressing of one of the victims. Interestingly, the victim who was undressed was the blonde one, while her friend had darker hair. The same thing is seen again at Lake Bodom. It is the blonde Bjorklund who is partially undressed and bears the brunt of the vicious onslaught. In both cases, the perpetrators also took several items, including clothing from the victims. In both cases, there is no actual violation. It seems like one of the two killers, probably the ringleader, had a fixation with women with blonde hair. The other tagged along for the theft and the thrill. After the Budem murders, Korhanen moved to Helsinki and lived close to the residence of a 16-year-old girl called Perko Rihanen. In 1963, she was killed in the street by being stabbed around 20 times. A blood-stained 25 to 30-year-old man, fitting Korhanen's description, was seen close to the site at the time the murder took place. Yes, this is all circumstantial in the same way that I argued the evidence for Gillström and Arsman was circumstantial. But considering everything, I think the two killers' theory makes more sense, particularly given Korhanen's history and his probable involvement in the 1963 murder. And I also firmly believe that the Lake Bodom killers were also responsible for the Lahti double murder. I think it's interesting that the police's three main suspects for the Lake Bodom murders at the time were a German, Arsman, and two people likely to have Swedish background, Gillström and Gustafsson. At the time, the country was very insular, and there was known to be friction with the Swedish community or anyone who was not Finnish. I wonder if Finnish suspects like Korhanen and Lytic were not investigated as thoroughly as they should have been because police were biased against certain people. You can see parallels with the Jack the Ripper case, where police and the public were keen to scapegoat Jews for the murders, and you may remember in my episode on the S-Bahn killer in Germany during the Second World War that the Nazis covered up his crimes because they didn't want anyone to know a good Aryan citizen could be a murderer. Sadly, I don't think this case will ever be solved, as too much time has passed and the investigation has suffered from tunnel vision. It's possible that the perpetrators would have been behind bars years ago had the police investigation been better handled and had physical evidence not been destroyed early on, with the scene being trampled by onlookers. Although 3 people died, there were actually 4 victims here, as Niels has not only had to live with the traumatic memories of that night, but he has had his name dragged through the mud and spent almost a year in custody awaiting trial based on very limited, spurious information. In May 2019, it was announced that a group of archaeology students were planning to dig in the area, but not to look for clues. They want to examine what visitors have left behind over the years, as it has become an important site in popular culture. To this day, groups of intrepid campers still spend the night on the shores of Lake Bodom every year on the anniversary of the murders. The names Anja, Mila and Seppo are heard in quiet, mournful whispers as a gentle breeze evokes memories of that tragic morning of June the 5th, 1960. Let's hope that the rustling of the leaves and the gentle breeze on the water are the only sounds that disturb the peace of the night. Thank you for listening to Prash's Murder Map, and I hope you're all staying safe during these difficult times. This episode could not have been made possible without the help I received from several people who I've credited in the show notes, but special mentions go to Marcus, who provided translations, including the audio and video interviews, and Simon and Jurgen for the voiceovers. I'm sure you'll agree they did a great job. Big thanks also to Mina from True Crime Finland, who covered Lake Bodom in episode 13 of her show and clarified some information for me, so please check out her excellent podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please do subscribe, rate, and if you're using Apple Podcasts, drop me a review. You can also visit my website, prashasmurdermap.com, follow me on Twitter, or email prashasmurdermap@gmail.com. I love to hear your comments and suggestions. Next time, we'll be visiting a murderous family in the rough and tumble western United States, so don't forget to saddle up. Until then, take care.